Looking back, I should have known something was different about that day when my third arm started itching. We Zorblaxians are known for our precise internal chronometers, but that morning, as I stood in my private meditation chamber at the Grand Intergalactic Combat Academy, even my backup chronometer seemed to be running slow. Grandmaster Krav Thul, the Academy's AI, announced through the chamber's sound system, "Your presence is requested in the main arena for the morning demonstration." I sighed, straightening my ceremonial combat robes. Another day, another chance to showcase why I'd maintained my undefeated status for the past 37 stellar cycles. Don't misunderstand, I love my position as the Academy's head combat instructor. But after defeating champions from 8,472 different species, the demonstrations had become predictable. The main arena stretched before me as I entered, its pristine white walls reaching up toward the transparent dome that showed off 3 of our system's 5 suns. 2,000 students from across the galaxy filled the observation decks, their various appendages, tentacles, and sensory organs all focused on the combat floor. The air hummed with their excited chatter, a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses. "Behold," announced Administrator P-Trock, his voice booming through the arena's acoustically perfect chamber, "the undefeated Grandmaster Krav Thul, winner of the trans-dimensional tournament, victor of the void, the being who cannot be beaten." I raised my 3 arms in acknowledgement, my retractable claws catching the light dramatically. P-Trock always did have a flair for the theatrical, though I had to admit he'd outdone himself with today's introduction. The student body responded with appropriate awe. Even the gaseous beings in the upper atmosphere section pulsed with admiration. Today I began my usual speech, my primary voice box resonating perfectly. "We will examine the art of multidimensional combat. As you all know, the key to victory lies not just in physical prowess, but in understanding the fundamental nature of." I paused, noticing Administrator P-Trock frantically waving all 4 of his sensory stalks. "Ah," Grandmaster P-Trock interrupted, his outer membrane flickering with what I recognized as nervous energy. "Before your demonstration, we have a special guest." Special guest? This wasn't in my carefully planned schedule. I prided myself on running the Academy's combat program with precision that would make a quantum computer envious. Unexpected changes were not something I particularly enjoyed. The Galactic Council P-Trock continued, his voice taking on that particular tone he used when delivering potentially problematic news, "has recently accepted a new species into our Federation. They call themselves humans." The word rippled through the arena. Humans. I'd heard whispers about them, a bipedal species from some backwater solar system who'd somehow managed to achieve faster than light travel despite still using primitive fossil fuels on their home world. Fascinating in an anthropological sense, perhaps, but hardly worthy of interrupting my demonstration. As part of their integration, P-Trock was still talking, his nervous energy now making perfect sense. "They've requested a formal evaluation of their combat capabilities. They've sent one of their, what did they call it? Ah yes, a swordmaster to demonstrate their martial arts." I couldn't help it. I laughed. All 3 of my laugh sacs engaged at once, producing a sound that echoed through the arena. A swordmaster? With actual physical weapons? How charmingly primitive. Even my youngest students had mastered psychic blade manifestation by their 3rd molt. "Very well," I said, regaining my composure. "Let us welcome this human representative. It will be educational for our students to understand why evolved species have moved beyond physical weaponry." P-Trock's sensory stalks drooped slightly. "Ah, yes, about that. They've actually requested a formal duel. With you, Grandmaster." The arena fell silent. Even the quantum fluctuations in the air seemed to pause. Me? Duel with a primitive using physical weapons? The very idea was absurd, and yet, that irritating itch in my 3rd arm returned. Perhaps this wouldn't be just another predictable day after all. The arena's main entrance portal shimmered, and I prepared myself to face whatever oddity these humans considered a warrior. Given their planet's high gravity, I expected a stocky, muscle-bound brute dragging some ceremonial chunk of metal. What emerged instead was underwhelming. Presenting Jessica Blackwood, Earth's representative and master of the ancient art of IIO, P-Trock announced. his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. The human stood barely taller than a juvenile Zorblaxian. Her frame was lean, wrapped in what appeared to be simple black fabric, with a single curved weapon strapped to her waist. Her hair, that strange protein filament humans display, was pulled back tightly, revealing features that seemed almost delicate by galactic standards. "You must be Grandmaster Krav Thol," she said, bowing slightly. Her universal translator rendered her words perfectly, though I noticed she'd declined the neural interface most visitors used. How quaint. "Indeed," I responded, using all three of my voice boxes to create an appropriately impressive harmonic resonance. Though I must admit, I'm somewhat surprised. I expected someone bigger, she smiled, and I noticed her teeth, those fascinating evolutionary holdovers humans still possessed. I get that a lot. The students in the observation decks were chattering now, their various communication methods creating a cacophony of interest and confusion. Several of my senior students were already calculating combat probabilities. I could sense their mathematical equations floating in the psychic ether. "Well then, Jessica Blackwood of Earth," I said, deciding to be diplomatic, "perhaps we should discuss the parameters of this demonstration. I assume you'd like to observe proper safety protocols. We can calibrate our psychic barriers to accommodate your physical limitations." She tilted her head slightly. "Actually, I was hoping for a traditional match. No barriers, no psychic enhancements, just skill against skill." The absurdity of her request triggered my laugh sacs again. "My dear human, I don't think you understand. Without protective barriers, the energy discharge alone from my lowest level techniques could vaporize me," she finished, that smile returning. "Maybe, but isn't that my risk to take?" Something in her tone made my third arm itch again. P. Trock, who had been hovering nervously nearby, suddenly spoke up. "Actually, Grandmaster, the Galactic Council has approved this request. They seem quite interested in evaluating human combat capabilities in their pure form." "Pure form," I scoffed. "You mean primitive form?" Physical weapons went out of fashion around the same time as biological waste elimination. Says the being with retractable claws, Jessica observed mildly. My claws involuntarily extended a few millimeters at her comment. The sheer audacity. A ripple of amusement passed through the student body, quickly silenced by my glare. "Very well," I said, drawing myself up to my full height. "If the Council wishes to see why evolved species have moved beyond physical combat, I shall provide that demonstration. Name your terms." Jessica stepped forward, her movements carrying a fluid grace I hadn't expected. Simple. First blood or clear submission. No psychic attacks, no energy projection, no probability manipulation. Just you and me, your natural weapons against my sword. "And when you lose," I asked, certain of the outcome. "I'll acknowledge the superiority of evolved combat techniques and recommend Earth adopt them for all future military training. And if, by some astronomical improbability, you win." Her smile widened just slightly. "Then you'll have to acknowledge that sometimes the old ways still have value." I gestured agreement with all three arms, already composing in my mind the lecture I would give about the foolishness of clinging to outdated combat methods. "Shall we begin immediately?" "One moment," she said, removing her outer garment to reveal closer-fitting attire beneath. The sword remained at her hip, still sheathed. "I noticed your arena has simulated gravity controls." "Of course," I replied. "We can adjust to any species' native environment." "Excellent. Earth standard gravity, then? Unless you'd prefer something else." The way she asked that question. Was there a trap here? No, impossible. Even if she'd somehow trained in variable gravity conditions, nothing could prepare her for combat against a being of my capabilities. "Earth standard will be fine," I declared magnanimously. "I wouldn't want you to feel disadvantaged in any way." How thoughtful she responded, and for a moment I could have sworn there was laughter in her voice. But that couldn't be right. What could possibly be amusing about facing certain defeat? P. Truck quickly adjusted the gravity controls while the students eagerly repositioned themselves for better viewing angles. Several of the gaseous beings had condensed into their most attentive states. "One last thing," Jessica said, stepping onto the combat floor. Would you like to know why I declined the neural interface from my translator? I assumed it was due to human technological limitations, I replied. She shook her head. No, it's because in my experience, when your opponent can't read your thoughts, they tend to make interesting assumptions. And with that cryptic statement, she took her stance, one hand resting lightly on her sword's hilt. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath, even those species that didn't technically breathe. I had faced 8,472 different species in combat. I had defeated champions, masters, and beings that defied conventional classification. This would be just another victory to add to that list. So why wouldn't that damned itch in my third arm go away? As per tradition, we were granted 15 minutes for preparation before the duel. I retired to my meditation chamber, though I hardly saw the need. Still, appearances must be maintained, especially with the arena's attendance swelling by the minute. Grandmaster Petrock's voice came through the chamber's communication system. The Galactic Council representatives have arrived to observe the match. Of course they had. This was probably some sort of diplomatic test. Show the humans their place while being gracious enough not to completely humiliate them. I could do that, probably. Also, Petrock continued, his tone peculiar. The human has requested permission to access the Academy's historical combat database during her preparation time. Granted, I said magnanimously. Though I doubt reading about proper combat techniques will help her now. I spent the next few minutes reviewing what little data we had on humans. Mostly standard biological information, dual cardiopulmonary system, redundant organs, high endurance, remarkable healing capabilities. Their combat history was fragmented, but one detail caught my attention. Petrock, I called out. This can't be correct. The database shows humans have been practicing sword combat for over 4,000 years. That appears to be accurate, Grandmaster. In fact, the humans' chosen style, Aido, dates back several centuries on their world. But why I genuinely couldn't understand it. They discovered nuclear fission over a century ago. Why maintain such outdated combat methods? Perhaps you could ask her, Petrock suggested. She's been quite interesting in her database queries. I activated the observation screen, curious despite myself. The human sat cross-legged in her preparation chamber, eyes closed, sword laid carefully across her lap. The database interface showed her rapid progression through combat records of various species. What exactly is she researching, I asked. Zorblaxian physiology, primarily. Particularly your species' reflexive responses, and Petrock paused. Nervous system layout. All three of my arms twitched. She's studying our vulnerabilities. Along with the historical records of every duel you fought in the past decade. Now that was interesting. Most challengers focused on my recent matches, trying to find patterns or weaknesses. This human was going deeper, examining fights from when I was still developing my style. The arena's energy had shifted when I returned. The observation decks were now packed, with several high-ranking council members occupying the prestigious quantum space platforms. I noticed representatives from at least 30 different species had arrived to witness the match. Quite a turnout, Jessica remarked as she emerged from her chamber. She moved differently now, smoother, more focused. Your people must really enjoy a good show. They enjoy seeing the evolution of combat arts, I corrected her. Though I am curious why maintain these ancient fighting styles when your species has developed more advanced weapons. You really want to know, she began a series of slow stretches that seemed oddly familiar. I wouldn't ask if I didn't. Those movements, Petrock interrupted, his sensory stalks quivering. They're Zorblaxian combat forms. I stared at the human in disbelief. She was indeed performing a simplified version of our traditional pre-combat exercises. How? Your database is very thorough, she said, completing the sequence. And humans are very good at pattern recognition. Did you know that every advanced species in the galaxy has some form of sword-like weapon in their history? The physics of blade combat remain constant, even across different anatomies. That's why you wanted the historical records, I realized. Partly, she agreed. I also wanted to understand why you've never lost. 912 official duels, 0 defeats. That's impressive. 913. After today, I said, but my confidence felt slightly forced now. She smiled that mysterious smile again. You know what I found most interesting in those records? You've never faced a human before, never even seen one fight. That means you have no idea what we're truly capable of. A murmur ran through the crowd. She was right, I realized. For all my experience, humans were an unknown quantity. Their database entries were surprisingly sparse when it came to combat capabilities. And you think that gives you an advantage, I asked, trying to regain my footing in this increasingly strange conversation. No, she replied, rolling her shoulders in what I now recognized as another Zorblaxian preparation technique. But it means your confidence is based on incomplete data. You're not just fighting me, you're fighting every warrior who's refined this art for 4,000 years. Every master who passed down their knowledge, every innovation born from combat necessity. Every lesson learned through victory and defeat. The arena had gone completely silent. Even the council members were leaning forward in their quantum platforms. Tell me, Grandmaster. Jessica continued, her hand resting lightly on her sword hilt. In all your studies of evolved combat techniques, did you ever consider why so many advanced species still maintain ceremonial weapons? Why they preserve their ancient fighting arts alongside their modern ones? I hadn't, I realized. I dismissed it as mere tradition, an evolutionary holdover like humans' vestigial teeth. Sometimes, she said, reading my silence correctly, the old ways persist not because we can't let them go, but because they still have something to teach us. The warning chime sounded, indicating 1 minute until the duel would begin. Around us, the arena's systems hummed to life, recording devices activating to capture every moment of what was supposed to be a simple demonstration. Looking at the human now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow walked into a trap of my own making. My third arm was practically burning with that persistent itch. Last chance to reconsider, I offered, more for my own peace of mind than hers. Funny, she replied, taking her position on the combat floor. I was about to say the same thing. The arena's ancient chime rang out, its harmonics designed to resonate with the nervous systems of all known species. Well, almost all known species. The human didn't even blink. I took my standard opening stance, all 3 arms positioned for maximum defensive coverage. My retractable claws extended to their full length, catching the light from the 3 suns overhead. This was usually the moment when opponents began to reconsider their life choices. Jessica Blackwood stood perfectly still, her hand resting lightly on her sword hilt. She hadn't even drawn her weapon yet. The corner of her mouth twitched slightly upward. Begin, Petrock announced, hastily retreating to the safety of the administrative platform. I decided to start with a basic attack sequence, nothing too flashy, just enough to demonstrate the futility of her position. My right arm shot forward in a testing strike, claws aimed at her midsection. The human wasn't there anymore. My claws sliced through empty air as she seemed to flow backward, her movement so smooth it almost looked casual, like she was taking a leisurely step rather than avoiding an attack that could have gutted her. Interesting reach, she commented. About 8% longer than your official measurements suggest. That caught me off guard. She'd not only dodged my attack but had used it to confirm something she'd suspected. I launched a more complex sequence, my 3 arms moving in the traditional Zorblaxian combat pattern designed to overwhelm single opponents. What happened next defied everything I knew about bipedal species limitations. Jessica weaved through my attacks with microscopic movements, each dodge seemingly calculated to waste as little energy as possible. She still hadn't drawn her sword. Your left arm telegraphs slightly before striking, she noted, ducking under a swipe that should have been too fast for her to see. Probably from that injury in the Centauran Championships 3 years ago. Now that was impossible. I'd never told anyone about that minor nerve damage. How had she? The historical records, I growled, pressing my attack. You weren't just studying our combat forms. 4,000 years of sword fighting teaches you to read bodies, she replied, sliding past another combination. Every species has their tells, even ones with 3 arms and regenerative capabilities. Enough of this. I launched into my full combat routine. The one that had earned me the title Victor of the Void. My arms became a blur of motion, claws attacking from impossible angles, each strike flowing into the next in a sequence that had defeated champions from across the galaxy. Jessica's hand finally moved to her sword. In one liquid motion, the blade cleared its sheath. The sound it made, that pure ring of metal against metal, echoed through the arena. Several of the more sensitive species in the audience recoiled at its primitive beauty. What followed next would be debated in the Academy's halls for years to come. Her blade moved with impossible precision, not blocking my attacks but redirecting them with tiny adjustments that sent my own momentum working against me. Each clash of sword against claws produced a sound like ancient music. Remarkable metal, I commented between strikes, genuinely impressed. Most physical weapons shatter against our claws. Damascus steel, she replied, parrying a particularly vicious swipe. Folded over 10,000 times, the atomic structure is quite fascinating. This was not going according to plan. Not only was she holding her own, but she was also analyzing my technique even as we fought. I decided to increase the pressure, adding the traditional spin move that utilized all three of my arms in a devastating circular attack. The human's eyes narrowed slightly. Her blade moved in a complex pattern I couldn't follow, somehow meeting each of my strikes despite the laws of physics suggesting such a thing should be impossible. The ring of metal on claws became a continuous song. That's an impressive combination, she said, her breath still frustratingly steady. But there's a flaw in it. Want to know what it is? Enlighten me, I growled, continuing the assault. The spin generates tremendous power, but it has to follow a specific arc to maintain momentum. Against multiple opponents, that's not a problem. Against a single opponent who knows the pattern. She moved then, finally taking the offensive. Her sword traced a line of silver light through the air, threading through my defenses like water flowing through rocks. I felt a slight pressure against my central arm, followed by a strange sensation. The arena went silent. I looked down to see a single drop of my bioluminescent blood hovering in the air, caught in the artificial gravity field. My central arm bore a cut so fine I could barely see it. First blood, Jessica announced calmly. How I demanded, genuinely baffled. That combination is mathematically perfect. Exactly, she replied. Perfect math, perfect form, perfect execution. But combat isn't about perfection, it's about adaptation. My wounded pride demanded action. I launched into my most devastating sequence, the one I'd used to win the trans-dimensional tournament. My claws became practically invisible, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. What happened next almost defied description. The human sword seemed to be everywhere at once, not so much blocking my attacks as suggesting different paths for them to follow. She moved like water, like wind, like something not quite solid. You know what's fascinating about Earth, she asked, still maddeningly calm as she danced through my onslaught. Our gravity isn't constant. It varies by location, by altitude, even by the position of our moon. We evolved in an environment that constantly changes. Another flash of steel, another drop of my blood joining the first in the air. This cut was on my right arm, just as precise as the first. Humans don't need mathematical perfection, Jessica continued. We adapt, we improvise, we take what works and discard what doesn't. 4,000 years of sword fighting isn't just tradition, it's evolution in action. The audience was absolutely silent now. Even the gaseous beings had condensed into their most attentive forms. I realized with a start that I was breathing hard while she still looked like she was warming up. Ready to try something interesting, she asked, shifting her stance slightly. What do you mean? So far, you've been fighting like a Zorblaxian. Why don't you try fighting like yourself? That comment hit harder than any physical blow. She was right. I'd been so focused on maintaining proper form, on showing the superiority of evolved combat techniques, that I'd forgotten the most basic lesson of all. Combat isn't about showing off. It's about victory. I smiled with all three of my mouth parts. Very well, human. Let's see how you handle something new. And for the first time in 912 duels, I stopped trying to prove a point and started truly fighting. The moment I stopped fighting like a textbook Zorblaxian warrior, everything changed. My movements became unpredictable, drawing on 912 duels worth of experience rather than formal training. Jessica's eyes lit up with what I could only describe as delight. "Now this is more like it," she said, adjusting her stance to match my new rhythm. Her blade whispered through the air, no longer merely defensive but probing my guard with quick, testing strikes. "You wanted this," I realized, blocking a particularly clever attack. "You were pushing me to break form." "Combat isn't about who has the better technique," she replied, flowing around my counter-strike like morning mist. "It's about who better understands themselves and their opponent." The battle shifted into something I'd never experienced before. Every exchange was a conversation, every movement a question and answer. My three arms gave me tremendous advantages in attack angles and defensive coverage, but her blade seemed to exist in all spaces simultaneously. "Tell me something," I said, launching a combination that mixed three different species fighting styles. "Why swords? Your species has laser weapons, particle beams, antimatter warheads. Why maintain this particular art?" Her response came in the form of a technique I'd never seen before. Her blade traced a complex pattern that somehow turned my own attack back against me, forcing me to dodge my own claws. "Because a sword," she explained, pressing her advantage, "is an extension of the wielder. No targeting computers, no power cells, no technological shortcuts, just skill, focus, and understanding." A quick series of strikes forced me back toward the arena's edge. Each attack was precisely calculated to test a different aspect of my defense. She was still learning, still adapting, even in the midst of combat. But more than that, she continued, her blade becoming a silver blur. "Sword fighting teaches us about ourselves. Every weakness, every strength, every moment of doubt or confidence is reflected in your blade." I launched a desperate counterattack, using all three arms in a pattern that should have been physically impossible to defend against. Her sword met every strike, but something was different now. She was working harder, her breathing slightly less controlled. "Getting tired?" I asked, pressing what I thought was an advantage. "Not tired," she answered, a grin spreading across her face. "Excited. Do you realize what's happening here?" "You're about to lose," I suggested, maintaining the pressure. "No, look around you. Really look." I risked a quick glance at the arena. The audience was completely entranced, many species having shifted to their most perceptive forms to better observe the duel. The Galactic Council members were leaning forward in their quantum platforms, recording devices whirring. "So we've drawn a crowd," I said, still not understanding. "We're making history," Jessica corrected, executing a move that somehow turned my own momentum against me. The first true exchange between human and Zorblaxian martial arts. Every attack, every defense, every technique is being recorded and studied. This isn't just a duel, it's first contact on the deepest level possible. Her words hit me harder than any physical blow. She was right. This wasn't about proving the superiority of evolved combat techniques. This was about understanding each other through the purest form of communication we had. "The database research," I said, finally understanding. "You weren't just studying our weaknesses." "I was learning how to talk to you," she confirmed, "in a language older than both our civilizations." The realization changed everything. Each clash of sword against claws became a word in an ancient conversation. Every movement was a sentence, every combination a paragraph in a story we were writing together. "Watch this," she said, suddenly shifting her stance into something completely new. "This is a technique developed by a Japanese sword master 500 years ago, adapted for Zorblaxian physiology." What followed was beautiful in its complexity. She took an earth technique designed for two-armed opponents and modified it on the fly to work against my three-armed form. The blade seemed to multiply, creating a defense that accounted for every possible angle of attack. "Impossible," I breathed, recognizing elements of my own style mixed with something entirely alien. "You created this during the duel." "Humans are particularly good at improvising," she replied. "We had to be. We evolved as persistence hunters, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Pattern recognition and adaptation aren't just skills for us, they're literally written into our DNA. The next exchange was unlike anything recorded in the Academy's history. I found myself incorporating elements of her style into my own, while she borrowed from Zorblaxian techniques. We were creating something entirely new, a hybrid form born from two species separated by light years and eons of evolution. Your academy teaches that evolved species move beyond physical combat, Jessica said, her blade dancing between my strikes. But you've missed something crucial about evolution. And what's that? I asked, genuinely curious now. Evolution isn't about discarding the old. It's about building upon it, adapting it, finding new uses for ancient tools. Her sword flashed in a complex pattern. Just like I've adapted this 1,000-year-old technique for use against a 3-armed opponent in variable gravity conditions. The truth of her words struck me just as her blade slipped through my defense again, adding a third drop of luminescent blood to the ones floating in the arena's gravity field. But this time, I didn't feel the sting of defeat. I felt the thrill of discovery. Looking into her eyes, I saw something I'd never expected to find in a supposedly primitive species, the same passion for combat evolution that had driven me to become Grandmaster, the same desire to push boundaries, to understand, to grow. The human hadn't just matched my skills. She had forced me to become better, to break free of the very limitations I hadn't even realized I had. And as her blade came around for another attack, I finally understood why my third arm had been itching all day. It wasn't a warning of defeat. It was anticipation of enlightenment. The arena's atmosphere crackled with tension as Jessica and I circled each other. 3 drops of my bioluminescent blood hung suspended in the gravity field between us, glowing like tiny stars. Both of us knew we were approaching the duel's final moments. "Shall we show them something really interesting?" Jessica asked, her sword held in a stance I'd never seen before. "What did you have in mind?" I shifted my weight, all 3 arms moving in perfect harmony. "A demonstration of true combat evolution. No holding back, no showing off. Just pure adaptation and skill." She smiled, that knowing smile again. "Think you can keep up?" "Human," I replied, my own mouth parts curving into a genuine grin. "I was about to ask you the same thing." We moved simultaneously. My claws became silver blurs as I launched into a sequence that combined everything I'd learned in 912 duels with the new insights gained from our battle. Jessica's blade sang through the air, meeting my attacks with a precision that bordered on precognition. The audience gasped as one being as we unleashed techniques that defied conventional physics. My 3 arms struck from impossible angles while her sword seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each clash sent shockwaves through the arena's atmosphere, causing the gravity field to ripple. "Remarkable adaptation," I commented as she flowed around a strike that would have tagged any other opponent. "You've already compensated for the gravitational fluctuations. And you've adjusted your rhythm to match my breathing pattern," she replied, launching a counterattack that forced me to invent 3 new defensive moves on the spot, making it harder for me to predict your strikes. Our combat reached a level that transcended traditional martial arts. Every movement was both attack and defense, every technique both ancient and newborn. The Galactic Council members were frantically adjusting their recording devices, trying to capture every detail of what was quickly becoming a landmark moment in combat evolution. Then Jessica did something completely unexpected. In the middle of an exchange that was pushing both our skills to their absolute limits, she laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but one of pure joy. "This is what I came for," she said, her blade weaving an intricate pattern around my claws. "Not to prove human superiority or challenge your position, but to show that true combat mastery knows no species, no evolution, no boundaries." Her words resonated with something deep inside me, triggering a revelation that nearly cost me my remaining pride. In that moment of clarity, I saw what she'd been teaching me all along. I laughed too, all 3 of my laugh sacks engaging at once. Then let's give them a finale worthy of that truth. What happened next would be debated in combat schools across the galaxy for decades to come. Our movements became so fast that even the Academy's advanced recording system struggled to track them. Every exchange was a masterpiece of precision and power, every technique a perfect blend of our respective arts. The decisive moment came without warning. We both attacked simultaneously, my claws and her blade meeting in a complex series of strikes that looked more like a dance than combat. Then, in a move that combined Zorblaxian power with human adaptability, we both found our opening. Her sword pressed against my central throat while my claws hovered millimeters from her vital points. We froze in perfect balance, neither able to strike without ensuring mutual defeat. The arena held its breath. Even the quantum fluctuations seemed to pause. "Well," Jessica said quietly, "this is awkward." Indeed, I agreed, noting that neither of us had moved a fraction. The traditional rules don't cover mutual killing blows. Technically, she pointed out, neither of us has drawn blood with these final strikes. Also technically, I added, neither of us has admitted defeat. We stayed locked in that position for several heartbeats, both human and Zorblaxian. Then, slowly, deliberately, we both withdrew our weapons. "Draw," she suggested. "Draw," I confirmed. The arena erupted in a cacophony of sounds as every species present tried to express their appreciation simultaneously. The Galactic Council members were already engaged in heated discussion, their quantum platforms vibrating with excitement. Petrock rushed forward, his sensory stalks whirling in confusion. But the rules stated there must be a clear winner. The terms of the duel. "We're satisfied," Jessica interrupted smoothly. "We both proved our points. Physical combat still has value, and evolved techniques are incredibly effective. The real victory here was in the combination of both." Besides, I added, feeling more energized than I had in decades, sometimes the best way to win is to recognize when victory isn't the most important outcome. Jessica nodded, sheathing her sword with fluid grace. The Academy now has records of completely new combat forms, created through the merger of our styles. I'd say that's worth more than a simple win or loss. Looking at the human warrior before me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in far too long: the excitement of discovering something truly new. In trying to demonstrate the superiority of evolved combat techniques, I'd instead found a truth far more valuable. True evolution doesn't mean abandoning the past. It means building upon it, adapting it, and sometimes finding wisdom in the most unexpected places. Even if those places happen to be a supposedly primitive planet called Earth. That was 3 solar cycles ago. The Academy's combat curriculum has changed considerably since then. We still teach evolved techniques, of course, but now we also have a mandatory course in what we call traditional combat integration. Jessica visits regularly as a guest instructor, helping us understand how ancient arts can enhance modern methods. The recording of our duel has become the most studied piece of combat footage in the Academy's history. Students spend hours analyzing every movement, every exchange, trying to understand the perfect blend of precision and adaptation that we achieved that day. But the real changes went far beyond combat techniques. The Galactic Council took notice of how quickly humans could adapt and learn. Within a month, Earth had been fast-tracked for advanced technology sharing. Turns out a species that can master alien combat forms on the fly might have other useful talents to contribute to galactic civilization. My third arm still itches sometimes, usually right before Jessica arrives for her teaching sessions. We spar regularly now, each bout adding new techniques to both our arsenals. She's even helped me develop a modified version of my combat style that 2 armed species can use effectively. "You know what the funny part is?" Jessica said to me recently, after a particularly intense training session. "Back on Earth, there were people who thought maintaining traditional martial arts was a waste of time. Said we should focus entirely on modern weapons and technology." That does sound familiar, I admitted, remembering my own dismissive attitude. Though I imagine they changed their minds after the duel. "Oh yes," she grinned. "Nothing quite like seeing your traditional sword art help establish positive first contact with an alien civilization to validate your life choices." The Academy's halls are more diverse now. We have students from Earth studying alongside beings from across the galaxy, each bringing their own combat traditions to share and explore. The energy is different, more vibrant, more alive. Just yesterday I watched a 6-armed centauran practicing earth sword techniques while a human student learned Zorblaxian claw forms using some clever prosthetic adaptations. Neither art was diminished by the exchange. Both were enhanced. Petrock still runs the administrative side of things, though he's developed an unexpected passion for Earth's historical combat records. He's currently working on a comprehensive database comparing martial arts evolution across different species. The preliminary findings are fascinating. As for me, I'm still undefeated in official duels. Jessica and I agreed that our match should remain recorded as a draw, unique in my 913 encounters. Though honestly, that's the duel I'm most proud of. My collection of titles has grown. They still call me the victor of the void and the being who cannot be beaten. But now they also call me the bridge between ways, a title I much prefer. It reminds me that true mastery isn't about proving superiority. It's about building connections, finding common ground in the clash of blade against claw. That persistent itch in my third arm turned out to be more than just a warning. It was an invitation to grow, to evolve in ways I never expected. These days, when younger warriors ask me about the key to combat mastery, I tell them something that would have shocked my earlier self. True evolution, I say, isn't about leaving the past behind. It's about understanding where you come from, appreciating what others can teach you, and being willing to adapt when the universe shows you a better way. Then I usually show them the recording of that historic duel. Because sometimes the best lessons come not from victory or defeat, but from the moment you realize that what you thought was primitive might just be the most evolved thing of all. And if you listen carefully in the Academy's halls late at night, you might hear the ring of steel against claws, ancient arts and modern techniques dancing together in the darkness, writing new chapters in the oldest story of all. The story of how we grow, learn, and evolve together.